If your last name is Campbell, Armstrong, Graham, Johnston, Elliott, Scott, Buchanan, McClanahan, Allison, Morrison, Jackson, McKinley, Houston, Crockett, or Wilson, there's a specific three-step migration story buried inside your family name. It didn't start in Appalachia. It didn't start in Ireland. It started on a violent, lawless stretch of the Scottish border that two kings spent decades trying to erase from the map. DNA has now confirmed what genealogists suspected for generations. These surnames didn't arrive in the mountains by accident. They arrived together in clusters, tracking the movements of the same closely related families across 2 oceans and 3 centuries. This is the real story behind the most common surnames in Appalachian America, and the DNA evidence tracing them back further than most families ever thought to look. For most people with Appalachian roots, the family history gets told in one direction only. Your great-great-grandparents came from somewhere in Tennessee, or Virginia, or West Virginia, or Kentucky. And before that, the story tends to go quiet. The records thin out. The courthouse is burned. The oral history stops somewhere around the early 1800s. And everything before it gets filed under Scots-Irish, a label applied loosely to almost anyone of British Protestant descent who ended up in the southern mountains, without much attention to what that label actually means or where it actually started. Here's the first real crack in that story. The Scots-Irish weren't simply British Protestants who chose to settle in America. They were the descendants of a very specific group of people removed by force from one borderland and transplanted to another, not once, but twice, across the span of about 100 years, carrying their surnames, their kinship networks, and their deep suspicion of governments and landlords with them every single time. By the time their great-grandchildren arrived in colonial America, this particular culture had already survived 2 forced displacements, had already built communities from scratch in hostile terrain twice over, and had already developed a fierce self-reliance and a deep resistance to outside authority that shaped everything about how they settled the American frontier. Davy Crockett, Sam Houston, Andrew Jackson, Woodrow Wilson, Neil Armstrong, Bill Clinton, and roughly a third of all American presidents trace directly to this same cultural lineage, not because the Scots-Irish were uniquely exceptional as individuals, but because they arrived in America in enormous numbers and settled the frontier with the same tenacity that had kept their ancestors alive in 2 of the most contested borderlands in European history. It began in 1603, when James VI of Scotland became James Thorne of England, and the Anglo-Scottish border, a violent, centuries-old frontier zone controlled by extended family clans called the Border Reivers, suddenly lost its political function overnight. The border clans had survived for generations by raiding each other and ignoring whichever king happened to claim authority over them, making them ungovernable by any conventional political standard. James IV solved this problem by forcibly breaking up the Reiving clans and transplanting them. Beginning in 1610, families from Ayrshire, Galloway, Lanarkshire, and the Scottish borders were encouraged, pressured, or outright forced to relocate to the plantation of Ulster in the north of Ireland, where confiscated land was being distributed to Protestant settlers as part of a deliberate colonial project to stabilize a region the English crown had struggled to control for centuries. The surnames that survive in Appalachia today carry the fingerprints of this first transplantation. Armstrong was one of the most feared border reaver surnames, so deeply associated with lawlessness that both English and Scottish governments specifically targeted Armstrongs for removal, hanging dozens of the clan's leaders before beginning the deportations. Graham, Johnston, Elliott, Scott, and Buchanan all traced directly to the same lawless border territory, the same clans that once raided across the Anglo-Scottish divide with such regularity that the very word Reiver entered the English language as a synonym for a particular kind of organized generational predatory violence. These families were then shipped wholesale to Ulster, where they arrived as strangers in a landscape that looked in some eerie ways remarkably like the one they had just left. Rocky, contested land at the edge of another political frontier, surrounded by populations that had good reason to resent their presence. Campbell came primarily from Argyll in western Scotland, a different origin, but the same Ulster destination, part of a second wave of voluntary Scottish settlers who crossed the narrow channel between Kintyre and Antrim because the land was cheap and the rents were low, and because for families from southwest Scotland, the Ulster coast was visible on a clear day. Here's the deeper layer that makes this story more than just historical biography. Why? Chromosome DNA research, conducted through projects like the Ulster DNA Project at Family Tree DNA, and detailed autosomal case studies published by Irish Origines has confirmed what the pattern of surnames alone suggested. Appalachian families who share these surnames frequently cluster together in DNA matching databases, sharing segments of DNA that indicate common ancestors, not just at the level of broad Scottish ancestry, but at the level of specific parishes and specific Scottish counties. Families from Strathaven Parish in Lanarkshire, from Ayrshire, from the specific border shires the reaving clans once controlled. A DNA case study on the Allison and Ellison surnames found that two related families, one that had kept the spelling Allison in Donegal, Ulster, and another that had shifted to Ellison in County Down, descended from paternal cousins who had departed the same Scottish parish around 1610, settled in different Ulster counties, and whose Appalachian descendants still shared detectable Y chromosome similarity centuries later, the same pattern of tight kinship clustering repeating itself again in America that had already repeated itself once in Ulster 100 years before. The wider Ulster DNA Project has documented dozens of similar cases, matching Appalachian Y chromosome results back to specific Scottish origins, with a precision that no conventional genealogy record could achieve alone, particularly for families whose paper trails vanish behind burned courthouses and incomplete colonial records. Morrison families in Kentucky have been traced back to specific Morrison clusters in Ulster, which in turn trace back to a specific part of Scotland. The clustering runs 3 generations deep across 3 continents. Picture the Great Wagon Road in the 1730s and 1740s, a rutted track running from Philadelphia southwest through the Shenandoah Valley, down into the Carolina Piedmont, and eventually into the mountain hollows that would become the southern Appalachian heartland. Wagon after wagon carrying extended Ulster families, not randomly collected settlers from across Britain and Ireland, but tight networks of neighbors and cousins who had migrated together from the same Ulster towns, just as their grandparents had migrated together from the same Scottish parishes 100 years before. The pattern was not accidental. It was a survival strategy that the border Reivers had practiced for generations, always moving in kin groups, always settling alongside people whose surnames matched their own, always building communities structured around the extended family networks that had kept them alive in some of the most contested landscapes in European history. Here's the twist that turns this from an immigration story into something with a specific, traceable genetic signature. Because these Ulster Scots families moved in such tight, interconnected clusters, and because the Appalachian Mountains subsequently offered enough isolation to preserve those clusters for generations afterward, the Y chromosome DNA of Appalachian men with these specific surnames still reflects the Scottish parish-level origin of their founding ancestors, in ways that broader ancestry databases struggle to detect. An Ancestry DNA or 23andMe ethnicity result might return simply British and Irish, which is technically accurate, but tells almost nothing about the specific geographic origin, clan affiliation, or migration route that produced it. Y chromosome testing, through projects specifically designed to track Scots-Irish lineages, can, in many cases, trace a living Appalachian man's paternal line back to a specific Scottish county, a specific clan territory, or in some cases, a specific documented founding family from the plantation era. So if your last name is one of the 15 named at the start of this video, here is what the DNA is actually telling you. Not simply that your ancestors were British Protestants who came to America and ended up in the mountains by chance. It's telling you that your family name survived 3 of the most dramatic forced migrations in the early modern world, from a Scottish borderland the Crown was trying to pacify, to a confiscated Irish landscape in Ulster, to a mountain corridor in colonial America that offered the same combination of difficult terrain and relative freedom from outside authority that these families had been drawn to at every step of the journey. The mountains of Appalachia and the mountains of the Scottish borders and the drumlin hills of Ulster aren't the same landscape. But they attracted the same families for the same reasons 3 times over. And the surnames on that list didn't end up in those hollows by coincidence. They arrived, as they had always traveled, together. Neil Armstrong was born in Wapakoneta, Ohio. He was the first human to walk on the moon. When he flew, he carried a fragment of Armstrong tartan with him. The Armstrong family name had traveled from the Scottish borders to Ulster, to Appalachia, to the Ohio frontier, to lunar orbit in 365 years. A border Reiver clan, forcibly removed from its homeland by a king trying to build an empire, whose descendants eventually carried that same restless migration instinct all the way to the surface of another world. The DNA that connects those dots is real, traceable, and still showing up in matching databases today. Every time 2 people with the right surnames and the right Y chromosome share a common ancestor nobody thought to write down.